Hi everyone, and welcome to Truth Over News. 20 years ago, the CBS show 60 Minutes tried to pull off one of the most memorable and outrageous election year hoaxes. It was the 2004 election between George W. Bush and John Kerry, and 60 Minutes claimed to have found documents showing that Bush disobeyed orders while serving in the National Guard, and that undue influence was used to enhance Bush's military record. The problem was that the documents were totally fake. They hadn't been typed on a 1970s typewriter, but in Microsoft Word. That hoax became known as Rathergate because the reporter was Dan Rather. Well, it's an election year again, and 60 Minutes has decided to push a new hoax. The latest story is that Russia is targeting US officials with secret microwave weapons that cause brain injuries.
Unfortunately, I can't get into specifics based on the classification, but I can tell you at a very early stage, I started to focus on Moscow.
That was former Pentagon official Greg Edgreen, who ran the Pentagon's investigation into claims that US officials had mysterious brain injuries, what has become known as Havana syndrome. Ed Green went on 60 Minutes this past weekend to claim that he has concluded that it was Russia that was attacking American officials. Who else? Of course, Ed Green can't give us any evidence for his wild claims because they're supposedly classified, state secrets, you see. But there's more. Not only is Ed Green claiming that Russia is attacking US officials, but that Russia is attacking only the best officials, as if some guy at the Kremlin keeps an updated spreadsheet of US intel officials' job performance review statistics.
This wasn't happening to our worst or our middle range officers. This was happening to our top 5–10% performing officers across the Defense Intelligence Agency. And consistently, there was a Russia nexus. There was some angle where they had worked against Russia, focused on Russia, and done extremely well.
So who are these so-called top officials? Some of them you'll know, but let's start with one identified by 60 Minutes as a mysterious Carrie whose full identity is being concealed, apparently. National security, of course.
Carrie says she was hit in Florida, and a year later when she awoke to the same symptoms in the middle of the night in California.
It felt like I was stuck in this state of disorientation, not able to function, what is happening, and my whole body was pulsing.
So we're supposed to believe that whatever this random Carrie does in real life is so crucial to world affairs that Russian agents with a secret ray gun followed her around from coast to coast. But they didn't try to silence her or kidnap her or anything like that, but rather they just zapped her with this secret weapon that supposedly causes headaches. To what end? And we're also supposed to believe that CBS is truly trying to hide her identity, even though anyone who knows her would immediately know who it is, and anyone with even a minimal research talent could find her within half an hour. The whole story is transparently false, presented with no evidence, so much so that you'd be forgiven for thinking that it was all an elaborate April Fool's joke. But it's real. We've looked at some of the other people claiming to be suffering from Havana syndrome, only one of whom was mentioned by 60 Minutes. And there's a very distinct pattern that emerges among them. First off, we have Mark Polymeropoulos. He's a former CIA agent who retired in 2019 to become an MSNBC contributor. He was one of the signatories of the phony letter which claimed that Hunter Biden's laptop was part of a Russian disinformation operation. That letter cost Trump the 2020 election. But even now that everyone knows that Hunter's laptop is real, Polymeropoulos insists that he was right. He recently told NBC that ours was a prudent warning. The Russians were going to push this narrative of Hunter Biden and corruption to hurt Joe Biden. Then there's Miles Taylor. If that name sounds familiar, it's probably because he's the author of the infamous anti-Trump letter by Anonymous. The New York Times published that letter claiming that Anonymous was a senior official in the Trump administration. In fact, he was the deputy chief of staff at the Department of Homeland Security. Trump probably didn't even know who he was. So he too claims to suffer from Havana syndrome. And then there's Olivia Troy. She was an advisor to Mike Pence, who seems to have had a really bad run at picking advisors and also seems to have made some really bad recommendations, like former Surgeon General Jerome Adams, who fueled the COVID panic. Her new career seems to consist mainly of being an anti-Trump talking head in the media. Well, she too claims to have Havana syndrome. There's also Mark Lindsay, who waged a campaign to get Twitter to censor people that he doesn't like, falsely claiming they were Russian-controlled accounts, always Russia. Lindsay used his official State Department email account to get Twitter to ban a number of people who've been involved in exposing the Trump-Russia collusion hoax, including our good friend Foya Fan, who is a leading authority on freedom of information laws and also an extremely reputable commentator. So this is not just some theoretical abuse. This really happened. We did a show on it last year. And of course, Lindsay too claims to have Havana syndrome. What are the chances that all these people who claim to be victims of Havana syndrome also happen to be rabid anti-Trumpers? And not just rabid anti-Trumpers, but people who are out there actively pushing an anti-Trump agenda. And we haven't even gotten to the lawyer yet. Guess who represents purported victims of Havana syndrome? Mark Zaid, who also made an appearance on 60 Minutes. If that name sounds familiar, that's probably because he was Eric Ciaramella's lawyer during the Trump impeachment #1 saga. Ciaramella was the so-called whistleblower who kicked off the first impeachment. What are the chances that out of the 1.3 million lawyers in the United States, the one who represents alleged victims of Havana syndrome is a Trump impeachment lawyer? So is it Trump hatred that causes Havana syndrome? Or is it that Havana syndrome goes hand in hand with attention seeking? Maybe it's a bit of both. But there are other factors too, financial factors. This isn't reported much, but there is actually a Helping American Victims Afflicted by Neurological Attacks Act. Conveniently, the act's acronym is Havana. This act was passed in 2021 and signed by Biden. It gives an untaxed lump sum payment of 1 year's salary to government employees with what is called a proven neurological injury. These benefits even extend to family members and former employees. So we're talking up to low six-figure untaxed bonus payments. That's a pretty nice incentive, but it gets even worse. What's the incentive of the guy who's the main source for this new Russia hoax? Well, deep down in the 60 Minutes story, we found this. After what he learned in his classified investigation, Greg Edgreen retired from the army to start a company to help the victims. He hopes to channel government contracts into treatment programs. So the guy who now claims that Russia is behind all these supposed attacks, the guy who can't provide any evidence, turns out to have a massive financial incentive in the whole scheme, specifically getting taxpayer money for so-called treatment programs. The whole thing stinks. So what about all the science? Well, as mentioned, 60 Minutes did not offer any evidence other than innuendo and the say-so of someone who claimed the evidence was classified. But there is science. These events have been looked at, and 2 new studies have found no evidence of any brain injuries or anything unusual in terms of the brain as compared to a control group. That means as compared to a group of people who doesn't claim to have Havana syndrome. This matches an earlier review. No brain injuries, no secret ray gun. One of the new studies did, however, find that the alleged Havana syndrome sufferers self-reported significantly increased symptoms of fatigue, post-traumatic stress disorder and depression compared with the control group participants. So it does appear that some of these people are indeed unwell in some vague way, but there's no evidence that this has anything to do with a secret Russian ray gun. And it doesn't take a genius to figure that out. According to the Havana syndrome narrative that we're supposed to believe, in the past 10 years, Putin's goons have been chasing the cream of the crop of American intelligence officials from coast to coast, blasting them with a super secret ray gun, but leaving no evidence of any kind. Why, if Russia had this super duper weapon, would they not use it on Ukrainian leaders, for instance? Also, what's the point of giving someone like Olivia Troy and Mark Polymeropoulos a headache? These guys are out there almost every day trashing Trump. The supposed secret weapon doesn't stop them from doing that. It's all just so transparently false and childish. So what's the bigger game here? Why now? Why 60 Minutes? Who is pushing this hoax? Yes, Greg Ed Green seems to be profiting off of this, but it's not like Greg Ed Green woke up one morning and decided to go on 60 Minutes to push a hoax, expecting everything to just fall into place automatically. There are far too many moving parts with this kind of scheme. Just look at the other people. Look at the mysterious Carrie, who wasn't even properly disguised. Look at Zaid, the lawyer. Too many moving parts for this to be one random grifter's idea. It's the focus on Russia that gives the game away. Whatever Havana syndrome is, whether it's something imaginary like what Chuck McGill had in the TV series Better Call Saul, or whether it's caused by stress or depression, there's no tangible or medical evidence that these people were blasted with some secret ray gun. None whatsoever. And there's even less evidence that it had anything to do with Russia. What we do now have evidence of is that an evidence-less story, which is totally based on innuendo, is being used as the new Russia hoax. It's a new cudgel to advance the anti-Russia narrative. That's where this is coming from. So why now? Well, there's an upcoming election. Intelligence officials like Peter Strzok used Russia to try and swing the 2016 election to Hillary Clinton. But he failed. His brothers and sisters at the CIA were far more successful in 2020 when they again used Russia to take the presidency away from Trump. So it's no surprise that anonymous intelligence officials are once again reviving the Russia narrative. In fact, we already saw that a few weeks ago with the Alexander Smirnov episode, which is part of this new Russia narrative. In contrast to previous election years, it appears as if this year's Russia hoax has been planned as death by 1,000 cuts. Instead of one big hoax, like the Steele dossier, there will be many hoaxes dribbled out over the next few months, all of which will paint Russia as this all-powerful villain that wants to boost Trump and destroy American democracy. As for 60 Minutes and its reporter, Scott Pelley in particular, we already knew that they are receptive to pushing intelligence community propaganda, and so they just did what they do. Who can forget Leslie Stahl claiming that Hunter's laptop wasn't real? Or that time when President Trump correctly defunded EcoHealth Alliance, and Scott Pelley, the same reporter, ran interference by pushing a totally false narrative that Trump was preventing a cure for COVID, when it was EcoHealth that was the danger and not Trump. Thanks for joining us in today's episode of Truth Over News.